Before the creation of the heavens and the earth, there was the existence of the ocean, and also an island blessed by the goddess who governed it, with blue hair like the ocean, Santna, to live up to the virtue of being the charming and pleasant figure in every way. Every night, in a place where luxury and ambition shine like stars with balls, dinners, and glasses of wine, people interacted with each other. But even in places like these, there was a place that retained all the filth and immorality. A scream shot out saying she was a rat. This happened in Kimura, a poor neighborhood, in a dark dead-end alley, where men shouted that she shouldn't even think about continuing to run because they knew everything. One of them approached the boy named Abel, threatening him because they knew he wasn't really mute, catching him by surprise. The man grabbed the boy by the collar of his clothes, lifting him furiously. Abel retorted for them not to touch him, moving away from the man, but the others insisted on pressing him because it was true he wasn't mute, and also that he was a woman. They stared intensely at Abel in a frightening way, saying that looking closer, his face was repulsive despite his body being beautiful, extending a hand towards her, and her golden eyes widened in fear as they tried to touch her, until she recoiled and launched an attack on the person who tried to touch her, and the man screamed in pain after being attacked. Abel attacked the man to the point of making him bleed with pieces of a broken bottle, threatening them if they approached her again. But soon one of the men approached anyway, pushing the girl hard against the wall to the point of making her lose her balance, threatening again because they had accepted her out of pity. After all, she was a pitiable orphan, but above all, she was ungrateful. Abel dropped her bottle on the ground when she was strangled, hearing that they pitied her because she cleaned shoes for a living, but she wasted the chance to change her life now. The man punched Abel in the face, making her grunt in pain when she was sent to the side, saying they would give her a week. If she didn't pay the debts for the protection services before next week, she would have to deal with a man and not a shoe. A few days later, in Sansalina Square, Abel continued her work cleaning the shoes of people sitting on benches, wondering what she should do, as there were only 2 days left for her deadline to end, which worried her. She had to get the protection money somehow still, her eyes focused on her work of caring for the shoes. And if they really dragged her back to a brothel like that, before that could happen, she would rather die. But what interrupted her speaking was the man who was caring for the shoe. He lowered the newspaper he was reading after saying out loud that he wanted to die instead of taking this woman's hand, Lucrezia, before entering the ceremonial hall, which caught Abel's attention, who was listening to the man's conversation. But above all, she was surprised when she realized she recognized that man, being none other than César Bonaparte, a handsome man with dark hair, the brightest star among the great nobles of Saint-Denis, and the protagonist of countless love stories was César Bonaparte, who finally met his fiancée, the youngest daughter of the Della Vallis family, a dark-haired girl named Lucrezia Della Valle. Based on a matrimonial agreement made between the two families in the past, this drew the attention of the aristocratic world by choosing César, the only heir of Bonaparte. The aristocrats congratulated Lucrezia for conquering an unrequited love, but César himself crumpled the newspaper he was reading with irritation, and with sarcasm said it was really incredible, because he knew exactly what kind of woman she was, sighing as he thought it was indeed destiny. Meanwhile, Abel watched César still taking care of his shoes, realizing it was really him, and being surprised, because she never thought she could meet such a famous man in Sansalina Square this way. And she wondered what she should do if she could tell them about her situation and thus ask for help. After all, they might feel empathy for her and give her some coins. César lit a cigar and exhaled the smoke, mentioning that they should continue with that plan. Next to him, the other man with thinner hair asked if he was talking about that insane plan, as it seemed crazy, and César asked back if there was another way to act. They should find a good girl and deliver her to Della Valle, which again caught Abel's attention. Realizing that this was not a simple opportunity like some gold coins, but maybe it was the opportunity that God was giving her once in a lifetime now. Suddenly, she asks to be sold, promising that she would become the most coveted lady of Saint-Denis. This silences César, who stares at the protagonist without understanding anything until the man next to him asks what this boy was talking about. Even César mocks that a shoe cleaner could distinguish people's shoes, saying he wasn't an idiot, until Abel insists that he was mistaken, introducing herself as Abel, but her real name was Adele Vives. and so she wanted to say that she would do exactly what he wanted from a person better than all the others could. Caesar asks if she was sure of what she was saying and stares at her, while the protagonist justifies that he needed a fake marriage between Bonaparte and Della Valle. Catching him off guard by knowing this information, Adele insists she just observed the situation and assumed this. In the marriage contract announced by the Della Valle family, the family's surname appears, but it wasn't decided who would fulfill it. So he thought that if he bought a woman and pretended she was a hidden heir of Bonaparte, he could avoid the obligation of the political marriage. It had to be a woman because the Della Valle family still didn't have a married son. The man next to him is impressed that Adele deduced all this just by observing the situation, and Caesar tells Jude to forget it because it was a waste of time. That's because the Della Valle family had been a family of excellent academics for generations. It wasn't a place where a shoe cleaner who only knew how to read and write could fit in. After being silent for a moment, Adele asks what could happen if she could do more than just read and write. Caesar asks if she spoke more than one language, and she agrees because she even knew how to speak Algerian, an Arabic language spoken in Algeria. He inquires where she learned those foreign languages, and the protagonist explains that it was by reading books in the civil library or listening to conversations of foreigners, which catches Caesar's attention as he felt he was being played by the goddess of the sea, and he runs his hand through his hair in a way that makes Adele curious. Until Caesar asks what he could do, because no matter how intelligent she is, she at least needed to be beautiful to be convincing. So, the two men get up after mocking her more than once, with Caesar stating that she was eliminated even before the preliminaries, walking away from her, walking as they leave Adele still crouched on the ground. After a moment of silence, she asks them to wait a little, and her beret flies away when she removes the hairpins, surprising the two men as they turn towards Adele, who was surprised by the beauty of the dark green hair and golden eyes of the girl, and they hear her ask if she would still be eliminated from the preliminaries. When the two approach her again, Jude says he couldn't believe she would really pretend, and it made no sense. But thinking about it, Adele's hair was similar to his, as were her eyes, seeming perfect from Jude's point of view. Caesar asks if Adele was interested in him, and she denies it, until he asks what she knew about her parents, and she replies that she was an orphan. After reflecting on her answers, he admits he is curious, because he didn't believe that Adele was foolish enough not to know she would be killed if discovered, and asks why she came to him. Then, she slowly says that it was because she was hungry, keeping the man's eyes on her. After a moment of hesitation, Caesar turns and says it's okay anyway. Walking a few steps away, he looks back and introduces himself as Caesar, the one who would dispatch her. And Adele touches her own chests, saying that in the place where they both wished, they should meet again, which makes Caesar realize that she even knew the quote from Durante's play, making him smile, feeling that he had found a quite useful woman, and responds that he would be waiting for her in the state of the Bonaparte until sunset that day. Later, the rain started to fall in the city and around the houses, but Adele still couldn't believe what had happened. After all, Caesar Bonaparte accepted her proposal. Now she wouldn't have to worry about being sold. But she thinks of a golden-haired girl she used to spend time with and thinks she couldn't tell Clarisse, her only friend, about this. Although Adele wanted to discuss it, it seemed that Clarisse was busy that day, but at least she decides to leave a letter for her friend. Suddenly, she hears knocks on the door and is surprised, wondering who it could be knocking at this hour, just looking at the door, when the knocks and noisy sounds continued to the point where Adele started sweating cold with nervousness. Although she couldn't believe it, a man forced the door of the house open and said he knew she would do this, looking at her threateningly, clenching his fists, because the protagonist not only didn't pay the protection fee, but was also trying to flee at this hour. He goes to her, furiously pulling her by the arm to teach her a lesson. But Adele resists, telling him to let go while trying to free herself from the man's hands. After hitting the man and being cursed by him, the protagonist begins to try to escape the place and from him, even when the man runs towards her, reaching out to prevent her from fleeing through the window. Adele gets nervous, realizing she was almost about to be caught, and the tension in the place makes her see everything in slow motion, until she remembers Caesar's words reminding her she would be executed if caught, and she just jumps out the window, thinking that the truth was she didn't care at all about dying, as long as she could escape that horrible place where she used to live, even after jumping from such a high place to escape the man and falling face down on the ground. She gets up and starts running desperately through the streets under the rain. As long as she could get out of there, she was willing to give up her life. Later, the protagonist was greeted by the Bonaparte butler, Ernest, who said they were expecting her arrival. And so he asks her to enter the grand family mansion, luxurious even under the rain that night, because the master of the house was awaiting her presence. Thus, she makes her way to Caesar's office, who was sitting at his desk working by candlelight. As he comments that she was a mess, it was obvious because Adele was completely soaked and injured after the previous escape. Then Caesar asks why his sister appeared there, looking like a wet dog, smiling when he asks her to explain to her brother exactly what happened. After a moment of silence and hesitation, the protagonist mentions the existence of an old man named Nino, who ran Kimura, a shoe shop. Since she didn't pay the protection fee, she was expelled, but in the end, he also intended to do more to her. But Caesar interrupts her, saying that old man was dead then, catching Adele by surprise with the sudden claim. Then he comments on how it was raining a lot that night. It rained so much that he heard the hill where Kimura was located collapsed. Unfortunately, due to this accident, during the collapse, a person died, which should be a common occurrence. After saying this, Caesar asks if there was anyone else bothering her, and she, still a little in shock, denies that there was no one else. The two stare at each other in silence for a few seconds until he says he would leave things as they were. Adele wonders what that was, as it was as if he always knew about Clarice's existence, which makes her clench her fists, but Caesar says there's no reason to worry, as she just had to ensure the plan would be executed in the best possible way. With that resolved, they could go straight to the main point. And the goal was exactly what Adele herself was thinking, because she should seduce Delaval's son and marry him. Her body, her heart, her speech, and every part of her body, from the tip of her nose to her feet, everything would be done as a perfect Bonaparte should be that way. Adele could deceive all the high society of Fornati. Then he lights a match to light his cigar, stating that she had 3 months to train, but as she fails to be recognized as a lady by him after that period, the plan would be terminated. Then he throws the match away under Adele's watchful eyes. She reflects that if the plan ends, her life could also be lost along the way, but she agrees anyway. Caesar asks if she didn't intend to know the reason for the 3-month time limit, and she asks if it wasn't because of the birthday party, which slowly makes him agree because that was exactly it. As he thought, the protagonist was smart enough to figure out his plan just by reading a newspaper article. Deep down, it seems she knew more about that family than Caesar himself. Then, he approaches her and raises her face by lifting her chin, saying he believed there was another reason, and asks if perhaps she wasn't interested in him, smiling at Adele. From his point of view, the only thing a country girl like Adele had was her pretty face, but he, as an older brother, should appear like a kind of savior. Therefore, he was sure this would make her want to cling to him, despite the protagonist's serious look. Caesar gives her a warning that he doesn't want her entering his room in the middle of the night and moves closer to let the smoke touch her nose. Until Adele thanks him for the warning, but she really wasn't interested at all, thinking that although Caesar was handsome, he seemed like some kind of weird lunatic, which brings a smile to his face, leading to a laugh. After all, her expression was indeed interesting from his point of view. Finally, he steps away from the protagonist, explaining that he was just warning her because it had happened before, and Adele agrees to keep that in mind, calling him master. But Caesar turns around and tells her not to refer to him like that, but as an older brother. And the protagonist watches him sit on his sofa after slowly agreeing, calling him older brother as commanded. Then Caesar, also calling her younger sister, says that from now on, she would become Adelaide Bonaparte. She was 5 years younger than him and used to live in Colo, which is across the ocean, believing she was just a commoner, until suddenly, for some reason, she ended up getting there alone, which makes her realize that Caesar was creating the whole story of how she became part of the family. Then, she asks if there is any possibility the president is part of this plan. Caesar's grandmother was the president of Signoria, Eva Bonaparte. Without her permission, this plan would have been impossible, and Caesar hesitantly denies it. That's because Eva wanted to see her great-grandchildren, but besides that, she was about to welcome Lucrezia with open arms, which makes Adele understand that Eva supported that marriage. He crosses his legs, asking if Adele isn't interested in other things, as there should be things she wants to know, and she asks about something important, until Caesar responds that his own parents were part of it. After all, if she intended to pretend to be his younger sister, she should know about it. But he was curious to know why Adele didn't ask about it, which makes her sweat cold. She wonders if there was anyone who didn't know about it, as Caesar's parents were so in love they abandoned the family and their youngest son. Thus, the protagonist says she heard they moved to another place as soon as Caesar turned 7 years old, bringing a smile to his face again after taking a drag on his cigar, relieved not to have to explain this, and they could just say that they gave birth to Adele later because they were in love, which was enough. He gets up to open the office door, telling her there is a maid waiting for her outside and she should just follow her. Smiling, Caesar hoped that the next time they met, he could see her with the demeanor of a lady, excited to witness her transformation. Outside, Adele meets a brown-haired maid who greets her, introducing herself as Epony Kaur, guiding her to where her new room would be from then on, which surprises the protagonist with how elegant and beautiful it was. Epony explains that the Bonapartes usually avoid luxurious things, so this room wasn't very extravagant, but she wouldn't have to face any inconvenience during her stay in that room. Even for Epony, this room was too simple to be a lady's, which was the opposite from the protagonist's point of view. The maid says she could always talk comfortably with her, and Adele agrees, correcting herself to speak more informally. Then the maid turns around and explains that she would have etiquette classes starting the next day, so it would be problematic if she ended up catching a cold. Extending her hand to Adele, Epony invites her to accompany her, because she would help her bathe, and guides her inside that large and luxurious bathroom. The protagonist gets nervous and stammers that it's okay because she could do it herself, but the maid insists that noble people shouldn't bathe alone, rules of etiquette. Still, Adele nervously holds her own clothes to accept the maid's words, although Epony asserts she wasn't making a request now. After that firmness in her words, Adele has no choice but to agree and ask for the maid's help. She begins to undress, and her wet clothes fall to the bathroom floor, but something catches the maid's attention. And it was the many marks and wounds all over the protagonist's body, which makes Adele quickly respond that everything could disappear in an instant, aware of it, because she had been beaten too much in her life, and they wouldn't leave scars. However, she cringes, asking if the maid intended to report what she saw to César, and wonders if he would break the contract upon realizing her body was repulsive. After a long silence, Epony mentions that the contract between Adele and César was valid until her marriage to Della Valle. It was fine if she was not discovered by César and Della Valle until this day, sighing with exhaustion, making the protagonist herself feel relieved, still having her own stained body. Additionally, Epony turns around, saying that even with those injuries, she was too skinny, so she should focus on recovering her body for now, while placing rose petals in the bathwater, saying that many should have told her this before. But now Adele was part of the Bonaparte family, which makes the protagonist reflect in silence, staring at her reflection in the water. Meanwhile, César, in his office, asks how his lovely younger sister was, and the maid reports that Adele did not seem very healthy. Besides, there were traces of violence all over her body, which makes him say that a pearl with scratches was not so valuable. However, Epony insists that this would be easily cured if treated regularly, becoming a beautiful woman as she gained more weight. Still, even after thinking for a bit, César comments that she was already quite pretty, recalling when he held her by the chin to analyze her features. But he was a little sad about her being his younger sister, which caught the maid's attention in reprimanding him, which brings a smile to his face, assuring that there was no reason to worry because he wouldn't do anything to Adele. After all, he intended to kill her as soon as the deal was over anyway. That night in the mansion, the protagonist ended up waking up during the early hours as usual, and observed through the mansion window the time when ships began to depart in the distance, and those who went out during the night to fish returned to the port. Soon, some fishermen distribute some fish they couldn't sell, which makes the protagonist remember that she woke up every morning at that time for that reason. Still, looking around her room, she couldn't believe she was living such a luxurious life now, which makes her ask aloud if she could manage to do well in that whole plan. Since she didn't think she could go back to sleep, Adele grabs a book that was nearby and sits back on her bed, starting to read until daylight breaks outside. At that moment, Epony appears in the room to wake her up, asking her to get out of bed now, asking if Adele couldn't rest well during the night, and she denies it, saying she just woke up a little earlier. Putting the book aside, the protagonist asks what her duties were for that day, which makes the maid mention that she seemed anxious about it, revealing that from today on she would always be busy and without breaks. First, they would start with breakfast, thus guiding the protagonist, already dressed and prepared for the day, to the table where various dishes were arranged. Epony pulls out the chair for her to sit down, asking if there was any dish she would like to eat. While sitting down, Adele responds that she is fine with anything, even if it's spoiled, and the maid mentions that she shouldn't be picky, which was a good virtue. Table manners were one of the most essential skills a noble should possess, as it was said to be the fundamental basis of etiquette. One starts using the cutlery position to the side, and so she indicates to the protagonist with her hands. She should keep a straight posture and chin up, never rest her elbows on the table, and keep her hands low while eating. The maid watches Adele follow her indications, praising her performance, and says she could start eating now. Upon tasting the first bite, the protagonist's eyes light up and her face gains color from the flavor. Beef carpaccio with arugula and celery, linguine with mackerel and abalone, monkfish wrapped in potatoes with tomato sauce. They were dishes that provided a perfect combination, good enough for Adele to want to lick the plates. Then, she worries that perhaps she had eaten too much to the point of seeming like a beggar. But Epony just says that it was a pleasant sight to see her eating so well. For now, she thought it appropriate that she had about 4 meals a day, because as a lady, she should have a strong and healthy body, which seemed great to Adele. After the meals, the two walk through the mansion's corridors, as the maid intended to show her around the house. Thus, she shows the study room, the conference room, the gallery, the game room, the dining room, and much more. Finally, there's also the central area of the first floor where Caesar's office was located, and Epony guides her to knock on the door whenever she visits, as it was part of the house rules. Walking outside at sunset, Adele asks if there was anything else she should be careful about, and Epony agrees, realizing she should tell her about it right away, revealing that there were a total of 6 people, including the maid, who knew about Adele and Caesar's plans. But in a few days, it would be 7 people, and a certain someone would teach the protagonist about the etiquette of being a lady, none other than Madame Flavia. Epony says that Flavia could be strict, but she was the best in her field, so Adele should follow her instructions, and Adele agrees, asking how she should greet the madame when she meets her, which makes the maid remember that she should teach the forms of greeting as well, so she holds the fabric of her skirt, teaching her to keep her back straight and slightly bend her knees, finally bowing her head. When Adele replicates, the wind sways her hair and dress, which catches the maid's attention, surprising her with that sight, especially because she was excellent at learning. Later, Adele returns to her room and lies on the bed, with Epony praising her for the day's lessons, and praying that the sea goddess watches over her that night. Then, the maid leaves the room, closing the door quietly. Leaving the protagonist alone, she leans on the bed and looks at the ceiling, thinking that everything was very quiet. And then she closes her eyes, remembering the noises she always heard in Kimura every day. It was not something she could hear in that house. It was such a pleasant silence that brought tears to her eyes, never imagining there was such a peaceful world, a world where it was normal to eat hot food and be able to sleep in peace. Suddenly, she hears voices shouting her name, telling Adele to run, and she opens her eyes, just as Epony quickly and abruptly opens the door to the room, desperately saying that they had a big problem happening in the mansion and she had to get up right now. That's because Madame Flavia showed up to visit the mansion suddenly. Running to the bed, Epony quickly says they should hurry to fix her clothes first. While Adele could barely understand what was happening so early, wiping her eyes, suddenly a loud noise at the door occurs, drawing their attention in that direction. When Flavia herself appears, a woman in elegant light clothes and a severe look who entered, a historic family that served the Bonaparte for generations were the Lourdons. Among them, Flavia Lourdan, who made her name in social circles, was quite well known. First, she was known for her beauty and elegance. Second, Flavia gained fame for her eccentric temperament and strict teaching methods with the girls. Entering Adele's room, she strikes her cane on the floor, shouting that Adele was in vulgar clothes. Despite her trying to apologize because she was in a hurry, Flavia shouts again, asking who told her to respond, which was absurd to even ask to teach, something so vulgar and disrespectful. The shouts make the protagonist cower, wondering what she should say or how she should act. That's when Caesar appears at the door, saying that if she had good manners, he wouldn't have summoned her. But he didn't expect to see her so early and leans back smiling at Madame Flavia. Seeing him, the woman marches furiously towards him, shouting that she wanted to explain. But Caesar leans close to Flavia's face, making her complain about being in public. Still, he asks if she slept well the previous night, and when she grumbles that she did, he smiles, because he would like her to have lunch with him, although he doesn't know if she would have time for that. And Flavia nervously responds that any invitation from him is always welcome. Caesar's smile makes her a little tense, and they stare at each other in silence for a moment, until she slaps her own forehead, commenting that he was serious, upset, because he always managed to seduce with his great looks. Finally, Caesar turns his gaze towards the protagonist, who was still covering herself, and asks if Adele was preparing to wash herself. Apparently he should have come later, which irritated Flavia for saying such careless things. And if that girl heard and got the wrong ideas, it would be a big problem, making her look away and think that if Flavia knew the true story, she would think differently. Still, Caesar doesn't care, because it was quite damaging to his pride, which makes Flavia shout asking for his forgiveness, and asks how Adele could act like that when she was just a humble being until her eyes catch something, making her approach the protagonist, who remained perfectly still in place, pulling her clothes to reveal her shoulders and neckline, surprising her. Flavia, with a look of disgust, asks what those dirty wounds were, and covering herself, Adele responds that it was nothing, as they would heal quickly and there would be no scars, without any interruption in the plans. But the old woman shouts that Adele wasn't good enough, not even imagining what hole she came from, possibly being beaten by drunks after selling her body. Even among the lower classes, it was too much for Flavia's standards. They have no courage and are just a bunch of lazy people. Even if 100 years pass, she would never be qualified enough to be part of high society, much less become a noble lady. Adele watches Flavia shouting all the time, and as the old woman says, it was clear she intended to use her body to climb the social ladder. This makes the protagonist recall how Nino said the same, despising her, just like many other men throughout her life and work, beating her. After a long silence, she apologizes to Flavia, clutching her clothes, because despite having many flaws, she was still trying her best, which makes Flavia turn around, still shouting, questioning if she could hide her origins through mere efforts, and if she really believed she could deceive those who were born and raised in high society, calling Adele arrogant just because she lived her whole life humbly. Then she responds that she never had parents to teach her anything, so such a thing was impossible. Still, her brother must have thought it was possible, and that's why he brought her there, which surprises Flavia a little. Adele says that if Flavia thought it was a problem, if she thought that situation was so absurd, she should discuss it directly with Caesar. These responses from the protagonist bring a smile to Caesar, who just watches the scene in the room in silence. Proceeding, the protagonist states that she has been rude because she was indeed ignorant, and therefore asks for forgiveness from the lady before her. In response, she tightens her grip on the cane in her hands, trembling a little. Her nervousness and frustration in response to this make her face turn all red, gritting her teeth, until finally, Flavia turns her face and adjusts her hat to cover her eyes, suddenly mentioning, with a trembling voice, that she had an appointment that day and ended up forgetting, so she would be leaving first, and bids farewell to Caesar. Thus, she passes by him, who was still smiling, out of the room and away from everyone, still covering her expression. Seeing all this, Caesar looks at the protagonist and comments with the same smile that his sister was indeed special, which brings a thank you from her, despite still sweating cold. Despite Adele's hesitation, Caesar continues to praise her for being quite understanding, almost mocking, because now Flavia should be feeling unwell after those words, and would be less exhausted if she were more obedient. After all, the Madame was kinder than she seemed, which made Adele a little tense, noticing his more forced smile. Then the protagonist asks if he meant that she should pretend to feel sorry for Flavia. The term pretend catches Caesar's attention, who approaches Adele, mentioning that it was she who was pitiful for living like this all her life, stopping in front of her, saying that if everything was just a game, there should be nothing wrong with it. Therefore, Adele should know what the smartest choice to make was, and so Caesar says as he leans close to her, Observing this approach and hearing those things makes her realize it was a challenge. Finally, Adele cringes while apologizing, thinking it was a challenge and a mockery to test her reaction again, and continues to say that she would try to meet his expectations of his younger sister, despite knowing that Caesar turned it into a great source of amusement. In response, he remains silent with a serious expression, then turns away from the protagonist still in silence, commenting that rumors said Flavia always got bored quickly. The next day, Adele went out with her maid Epony through the corridors, asking if she would take her again to learn how to stand up. When they arrive to open the doors of a room, the maid responds that there is no reason to worry. In the hall they enter, there were several shining silver statues, as well as Flavia, who was standing there waiting, and Epony says that whatever Caesar decides will happen. Noticing the people who entered the hall, Flavia crosses her arms and lets out a heavy sigh, saying that the surname Bonaparte was not a name someone like her should have, so even the great blue star is on her chest. Adele listens to her words in silence, about how even the sea goddess would be angry about this. Flavia insists that although the Duke asked to make her a worthy lady, she believed there was still a different lesson to be done before that. Thus, she orders Adele to kneel, confusing her with what she just heard. The lady points in her direction, saying that she should have heard her words very well, and orders her to kneel again. The protagonist wonders why she was being treated so disgustingly, whether it was because she was a shoe cleaner, or because she did not come from a noble family. If it was because they wanted to hurt her, since if that was her big goal, she chose the wrong way to act. After all, a shoe shiner's knees have no value at all. So Adele kneels as ordered, catching the lady by surprise. She approaches, warning her to listen carefully, and steps on the protagonist's thigh with her heel. Pushing her shoe against her dress, she says that Adele was merchandise, and all she had to do was be silently sold to the Della Valle family. If she wanted more than that, she would become shark food. That's why Flavia was putting her in her place, something Adele had no choice but to agree with. Finally, the Madame removes her foot from the protagonist and orders her to stand up again, as they would start the lessons. First, they would go over walking posture, and soon Epony approaches carrying something in her arms. It was a shoebox, which Flavia explains would be responsible for correcting her crooked walk. Adele was taken by surprise by the delicate black heels, still hearing that she should always wear those heels when walking, even outside of her lessons. Despite the orders, the protagonist was enchanted with her new shoes and gently touches them with her fingers, before finally taking them out of the box to put them on her feet. But to her surprise, the heels were not the right size, and she tries to comment on this to the Madame. But the woman, with a dark smile, orders her to stand up anyway and start walking right now. She points to a corner, where Adele should do her walking training, and go to the end of the corridor, ordering her to do this until she tells her to stop walking, even though the protagonist's toes and heels are squeezed in the shoes. Obviously, Adele's walk was not easy at all, and she soon fell face first to the ground with a scream. Her fury made her take off the shoes and throw them away, complaining that she couldn't take it anymore. But Flavia says that this was not the correct behavior during a sacred lesson, and it was obvious that the protagonist had no desire to learn. Shouting that being so, Adele was not worthy of becoming a Bonaparte, and orders her to leave immediately. The Madame was smiling the whole time with that dark expression, shouting just to scare that girl she saw as disgusting. But to her frustration, the protagonist got up again and went back to her walking training over and over again despite this. Even wearing extremely small shoes for her feet, Adele walked for hours without stopping. At a certain point, she looked at the Madame and asked if she should keep walking, with no expression of pain on her face. Flavia thought that being poor, it was expected that her actions would be inelegant, but she was too frustrated with that. Then, the Madame tells Epony to leave for a moment, to which the maid bows while apologizing, explaining that Caesar ordered her never to leave Adele alone, but the Madame insists she discussed this with the Duke beforehand, and certainly wouldn't punish her for it, so she asks in the name of Loredan for her to leave the room, until despite hesitating, she finally agrees and leaves. When they were left alone, Flavia begins to refer to the protagonist as a shoe shiner, telling her to sincerely leave that mansion, still staring at her with that angry expression. Adele responds that it was not the will of the one who brought her there, but the Madame insists she was saying it now, because compared to the other Bonapartes, it might be that the Della Valle family was not the best option, but it was better than a despicable and inelegant person like her. That's why the Madame suggested she put herself in her place and leave. Adele's safety was guaranteed by Loredan, and she would also receive a good dowry for it, but the protagonist's expression didn't change at all. When she asks if she was saying that because she wanted her brother to marry Lucrezia, which catches the lady off guard. The protagonist says that Flavia must think she came there to follow her brother's orders, but that was not the case. So, she apologizes to the Madame, but she must inform her brother what she just heard. This makes Flavia shout that this was the will of the Duke's parents, as well as Adele's parents by consequence. The promise between Della Valle and Bonaparte was much older than she thought. So, she asks if because of this promise, Caesar might consider marriage. Many women desired him, but still, he continues with childish attitudes without settling down with anyone else. For Flavia, it was unacceptable that this noble family does not continue. Now she could understand that Adele ended up involved in a great dispute, which makes the protagonist bow in thanks. But she unfortunately couldn't follow her orders, and she says this with an indifferent expression. This again caught the Madame off guard with her determination and stubbornness, making her shout that Adele was audacious, for she clearly only wanted more money, but the protagonist denies it, responding that she only liked the food here, and says this recalling each of the dishes, desserts, and all kinds of things she could savor in that house. This left the Madame even more confused by what she just heard. So Adele explains that money or a future was an exaggerated luxury for her. For them, who struggled daily, such a promise of a future was nothing but a utopia, worth less than food for them from the lower class. Flavia shouts that the reason Adele stayed, there was only hunger, which was certainly the action of a snake. A point that the protagonist agrees with without hesitation. After all, she had been living her whole life that way, unable to sleep due to great hunger, and surviving an entire month on just a piece of hard bread, living without knowing what tomorrow would bring, worried about the next meal she might or might not have. Therefore, Adele had no more to think about, so she apologizes to the Madame again, bowing. But no matter what order she gives her, she did not intend to leave the Bonaparte family. Later that night, Flavia found herself walking through the corridors illuminated by the night with the same tense expression. Thinking it was a great disaster, it was uncomfortable, but Adele still had an interesting charm even wearing those shoes. It was clearly absurd, but it still made her wonder why she could imagine Adele and César together. She was so confused that her hand fell on her forehead, realizing she needed to find another solution as quickly as possible. Thus, a week passed since Madame Flavia's enduring lesson. It was a period that passed so quickly that the protagonist barely noticed the days going by, but during that time, she learned a few things: tone of voice, etiquette, social tips, how to talk to superiors, how to decline a gentleman's invitation, but above all, during her walk through the beautiful garden, how to walk properly, even though her feet were still sore from keeping those heels on during the lessons. When Adele felt pain in her feet and stopped walking in the garden, Epony asks if her feet were okay, and the protagonist agrees. Although the maid knew it was a lie, she couldn't do much for her lady now, but mentions that, in fact, Flavia knew from the beginning that Adele's steps were always perfect. The speed of her learning and improvement was surprising, and it was obvious even the Madame noticed it. The protagonist was able to absorb information easily like a sponge, even when Flavia explained things only once. Although constant training is essential, the maid believes that no one would consider the protagonist to be of lower class. After hearing these words, Adele slowly turns her face and says she understands, but doesn't comment further. It was then that, during the walk, something caught her attention in the distance, which was a group of ladies conversing. The protagonist asks who they were, as she thought it was the first time she saw them, and Epony explains that they were part of the Orconina delegation. Adele looks at the maid as she tells her that they had been in the mansion for some time, but the protagonist didn't know because she was busy with training. But a few days ago, the second prince of Orconina ascended to the throne, all with the support and help of Lord César. It took a lot of effort because he was a prince without a stable base, but in the end, he was able to achieve his goal. So the Emperor of Orconina sent a gift there in exchange for the help he received. That's why the mansion had been a bit noisy recently, full of ladies making visits. Adele notes that by influencing the throne of the neighboring nation, her brother's position would become even greater. Suddenly, the three ladies conversing in the distance notice and shout for César when they see him standing nearby and run to him. The Duke smiles and greets the ladies, commenting that it was a beautiful morning, as Epony and Adele just observed the scene. The favoritism of fate and the goddess, the prodigal son of Bonaparte, were all characteristics of César, who received the blessings of the sea goddess. But he doesn't deserve them, for from Adele's point of view, it didn't seem that the Duke valued them that much. In fact, César always seemed empty inside, although that might not make any sense. Epony mentions that they should leave before someone notices them, and the protagonist agrees. As the two walk away from the conversation, even the Duke noticed their presence and watched them disappear into the distance. One of the ladies notices that César was looking the other way and asks what happened, to which he replies that he thought he saw a mermaid, also catching the lady's attention in the direction where the Duke was looking. However, he covers the woman's eyes with his hand, smiling as he says that despite this, there was still a mermaid right there. When he leans in, the lady says he is being very naughty, and her face blushes with César's teasing. The Duke leans in to whisper in her ear, asking if she would come again at night, as he would be waiting for her. While blushing, the young woman says that if the Duke promises to take her seriously, she would visit at night, though he remains silent. Thinking that the lady is thinking nonsensical things, it seems time to bring her back to reality before sending her away. After all, she was mixing her feelings there, when they should be just casual encounters, which makes the Duke touch her golden hair, thinking she was more exciting before. But now, thinking of Adele's greenish-blue hair, it no longer seemed so appealing to his eyes. So, to her smile, the Duke says she was really very cute, and continues by saying it was about her presumption, suddenly breaking the girl's smile. Finally, he turns to the other side, leaving the girl frustrated beside him in silence. With tears in her eyes, she says after a moment that she would be leaving, and the Duke wishes her a good journey, still smiling. Thus, he walks away from those ladies, ignoring the tears of the girl he left behind, thinking it was a big nuisance, and the others try to console her. César lights a cigar during his walk, thinking that Adele should have taken that path now and tries to follow her previous steps. Suddenly, he hears someone shouting to let go, which catches his attention, to a scene happening there in the garden between two people, where an angry-looking man was holding Adele's arm, who was resisting after falling into the water. A few minutes before the Duke witnessed the scene, the protagonist and her maid had left the previous environment and walked near the fountain. Adele's feet were still red with all the injuries, but the pain was so much that she found herself falling to the ground and sending her umbrella flying, worrying Epony. The maid runs to her, apologizing and asking permission to check her feet right away. Then, she takes Adele's shoes and notices her feet were full of wounds with blood and ugly blisters. Immediately concerned, Epony alerts that this would no longer work, so she shouldn't push herself so hard. Still, the protagonist asks if she didn't have any anesthetic, as she could be fine if she endured a little more. Seeing her get up, the maid just looks up, clearly worried about her lady. After a moment of silence, she says they should end the lesson for the day now, and gets up from the ground saying she would fetch a wheelchair, but for now, Adele should rest her feet because she would be back soon. So, Adele sat with her feet in the water of the fountain, resting while looking at her reflection. She realizes that soaking her feet in the water helped relieve the pain with a cool temperature. Though it was a bit difficult, it was nothing compared to her days in Kinmora. Suddenly, her attention was stolen by a loud laugh coming from behind her. Passing nearby were three young men talking about the heart of a mermaid, which catches Adele's attention as she recognizes them as nobles. She worries because they were approaching and realizes she should hide quickly somewhere. As she gets up, the voices talk about not having seen Lucrezia anywhere, as they thought she would appear as the Duke's partner. Another replies that the Duke of Della Valle had been confined to his quarters, though he was expected to come out soon. It doesn't take long for the three men conversing to reach the fountain, walking around while the protagonist hid from them. After a while, she wonders if they had left, so she moves to try to peek. Just when one of the men appears behind her, catching her by surprise as he opens a dark smile upon seeing what he found there. Then he grabs Adele by the wrist and shouts that he found a woman hiding in the fountain, pulling her. The force of the pull makes the protagonist fall hard into the fountain, getting completely wet. Another man approaches and reprimands Henry for crossing the line, but Henry says he didn't push the girl as she fell on her own. Adele tries to get up with her wet clothes and looks in the direction of the men, which immediately makes them notice the type of woman they had found, bringing smiles to their faces. Henry comments that he just caught a mermaid instead of a person, and leans in to ask her identity, as she didn't seem like a lady or a noble since she didn't even have shoes, but her dress was too good for a maid. When Adele remains silent, Henry insists by threatening her, as saying nothing would get her punished. Finally, he approaches to pull her by the arm again, asking if she was acting like that on purpose to get punished. The other man asks Henry to stop because this was Bonaparte territory, until he shouts back, asking if he should be careful just because of that while trying to punish a maid. Finally, Adele says that if he pulls too hard, her arm will come off, and she looks at him seriously, saying that his grip was hurting her arm and wrist with that aggression. The men are surprised because she was speaking like a noble, but the protagonist tells Henry to let her go or he would regret it. That's when they all start laughing at her words, questioning who she thought she was, and comment on her rough hands, probably belonging to someone of a lower class, suggesting that maybe she sold her body on the streets and snuck into the house, but now she had several clients to satisfy her work, and Adele gets tense with the atmosphere. She screams for them to let her go, but Henry keeps pulling and cursing. After all, she shouldn't even be treated like a human by a bastard like Caesar. And they didn't even know what she should be expecting by crawling into that mansion, but they start ordering her to go to bed with them, pulling her by the arm, until suddenly, the Duke himself appears in the distance behind them, tapping his foot to get the men's attention. And they all turn towards Caesar, who seemed completely calm even in that situation. Despite recognizing him and saying his name, Caesar gives a sarcastic smile, saying they should have called him a bastard as they did before. He stares at Henry Petch, who starts to sweat cold after being recognized too, and approaches, commenting that the Duke Petch will certainly be delighted to know what was happening there, since he came to the Bonaparte mansion with his old body just to ask for some money to borrow, and gives that fake smile again. Caesar stares threateningly at Petch, mentioning that Madame Petch accompanied him to feel more comfortable asking for help, which caught Henry off guard. He wanted to lash out at the Duke after he insinuated that his mother hit on Caesar, but the other men hold him back before he does, asking Caesar to calm down too, as his words were going too far. But the Duke places his hand on the man's shoulder, saying that they were the ones who crossed the line by treating his younger sister as someone who would sell her body. That's when Henry finally goes into shock, looking over his shoulder at Adele, realizing she was actually related to the Duke. He looks again at Caesar, trying to understand the situation, and he mentions that her name was Adelaide. Then he releases Henry to step into the fountain to cover the protagonist's wet body with his coat, and asks her what was happening for things to end up like this, which surprises her a little. She averts her gaze in the direction of the nobles, noticing that they all seemed tense and sweating cold with nervousness. After a long silence, the protagonist asks how her brother arrived there, until Henry shouts that it was a big lie, as the entire territory knew he had no sister. The Duke turns and agrees that until then she wasn't there, but now he had brought her to his home. After all, his parents are still in good shape, but he certainly didn't need to explain such a thing to the nobles, which makes them nervous again. Henry, exasperated, insists that it wasn't entirely their fault. After all, it was impossible to know that Adele was a noble lady walking that way. With her bare feet covered in injuries, the Duke and the protagonist look at the blisters on her skin, still under the water. Finally, Adele apologizes because she was practicing so as not to be ashamed to the Bonaparte name, but hurt her feet in the process. She says she was having difficulty walking, so she asked for some medicine, but didn't know something like this could happen. Despite the tension from the nobleman, the Duke lifts the protagonist in his arms, reminding her that he warned her not to push herself too hard. After all, there's no reason to gain reputation that way. Her health was much more important than that. Still, Adele responds that if she becomes a subject of ridicule in a social circle, the Bonaparte reputation would be ruined. To her surprise, the Duke leans in to kiss her forehead, saying there was no reason to worry. After all, they were a family. The term family was something Adele had never heard in her entire life, not even as a bad joke. She wonders if nobles usually did this with their families, and what should be the right way to react to this affectionate treatment. Then, after a moment of hesitation, the protagonist touches the Duke's face, thanking her brother. He smiles in response to her gratitude, still holding her in his arms. Meanwhile, the nobles whisper if she really was his sister, which shouldn't be surprising since they looked quite similar. Finally, Caesar looks at the men and asks them if they really wanted to have fun with Adele, threatening them directly, in a way that makes them step back, laughing with the excuse that it was just a big joke, and others try to say they were just trying to stop Henry's jokes. When they justify not knowing that Adele was his sister, Caesar asks if it was okay to act as they did if she wasn't his sister. Tense, they step back, making excuses that it was just a big mistake on their part, asking for forgiveness, until the Duke responds that he should also apologize to them, as he planned to pursue them without worrying about which family they belonged to. Later, Caesar continued walking, carrying the protagonist with her injured feet in his arms. The two remain in complete silence, despite Adele's gloved hand holding the borrowed coat to cover herself. This catches the Duke's attention, who asks if she was feeling uncomfortable, and asks her to be patient, as they were almost at the mansion. But little did they know that several ladies were watching the scene from a distance behind some trees. It doesn't take long for the two to arrive and enter the residence again, just when the Duke looks at Adele, asking if he should really do something like that, and she slowly apologizes, turning away as she was about to leave. She gets down from his arms and steps on the floor, but the pain makes her groan, collapsing to the ground again, still under the Duke's gaze. With a sigh, he notes that she seemed to be doing many different things. Asking where Epony was, the protagonist responds that since she couldn't walk, the maid left to get a wheelchair. However, that wasn't the answer the Duke was looking for, as he didn't intend to spend money on a cripple who couldn't even stand on her own. The protagonist apologizes again, as she didn't expect to meet him in these conditions, until she is surprised by the sharp pain caused by Caesar's own foot stepping on hers, asking if by any chance Adele had some kind of fetish for being stepped on by others like that, if it was a habit she acquired on the streets as long as they were men, looking at her in that pathetic state. After all, otherwise, why try to do something they weren't even aware of in Bonaparte territory? Adele, with her fists trembling, asks if he was implying that she provoked all this on her own, which makes the Duke ask back if she knew that, to which she denies the allegation. After a moment, he laughs, catching the protagonist completely by surprise, until he says that Flavia has been acting maliciously, still with his foot on Adele's, asking if she couldn't do anything right, whether it was fighting and knocking them down, or flattering to get favors. There should be various ways to do it. Under that gaze, the Duke says she was good at setting her pride aside and begging, but asks why he should waste money on someone who did nothing right. The protagonist covers her mouth to stifle her groans of pain, not responding. Then she says it's her fault, repeating it several times still on the ground, and curls up. Finally, Caesar turns and agrees, glad that at least Adele was aware of this fact. After removing his foot from hers, he orders her to treat her wounds before they start to rot. At that moment, the maid appeared running, calling for the Duke. But before she could speak, Caesar states he will listen to her when she has something better to say to him, announcing that the lessons would be cancelled for 3 days, and leaves the hall, leaving them behind. While the maid tended to Adele, who was on the ground, the Duke returned to his office desk. Smoking his cigar, he analyzes Henry's profile, the second son who couldn't continue his bloodline, trash that couldn't be independent, wondering if that's what was happening in the Bonaparte garden, and smiles to himself as he never knew what they were talking about. He gets up from his chair, thinking he should clean himself up. The plan went wrong, as Adelaide was exposed, making it impossible to have another woman as a wife. Now, whatever happens, he had to ensure Adele's permanence as a Bonaparte. For the Duke, it was certainly exciting, especially thinking about her green hair that shone like aquatic plants, her pale skin like the sun, her unnecessarily large bust, still knowing that the noble bastards should remember what happened. However, Caesar himself was confused, as he ended up feeling excited the moment he held Adele in his arms. With a smile, he realizes that if this is what he was feeling, then it was all over for him when Erza della Valle met her. Suddenly, amidst his thoughts, he hears a knock on the door and tells the person to come in. Madame Flavia appears, greeting the Duke slowly. The two look at each other from that distance in silence under the sunset light as Caesar turns from the balcony to the Madame, finally starting to speak, saying he doesn't mind educating the poor, but he doesn't want to spend too much on it. She falls silent before apologizing, nervous about the pace of the conversation. However, the Duke firms his voice, ordering her never to bother him again, pressing Flavia, saying that she was a wise woman, so he assumed she would understand what he meant by that, and she leaves the room. With an enraged expression, the Madame thinks that the shoeshiner must have used some unpleasant trick to overload her own feet on purpose. Now, all the effort she put into learning about the Bonapartes was totally in vain, cursing the protagonist again. Meanwhile, a group of ladies discusses the rumors of Lord Caesar having a mistress, although the woman was barefoot and he shouldn't like women without class. They discuss that maybe the Duke's taste has changed, which was a possibility, but it didn't seem like a normal relationship given that Caesar was being too friendly, which was big news after all. The Lord never let women into his residence, and they discuss animatedly under the sunset, until the red-haired woman stands up abruptly, shouting who she was, then saying she wasn't feeling well, so she would go home now, and leaves them, who bid farewell to Lady Genevieve. Genevieve runs away from the other ladies, who suspect she wasn't really feeling unwell when she seemed perfectly normal. She holds her dress while running, thinking it was a big problem, but she should inform Lucrezia about it right away. The woman runs to write a letter by candlelight, recounting the autumn in Fornetti, and that now she should be almost done with her self-reflection. But to her surprise, she couldn't tell Lucrezia that there was good news, as a dark cloud hangs over her future. According to what she heard from the ladies who gathered at Bonaparte to see the heart of the mermaid, even today, Caesar was seen entering the house with a woman in his arms. She questions how many more times he would need to break her heart before being satisfied, and what kind of indecent lady would try to seduce César. However, Genevieve wished to meet Lucrezia as soon as possible to provide her some comfort in her sadness. Thus, she shouts to deliver that letter to Della Valle right away, finishing with Genevieve's signature. Meanwhile, after reading the letter, the dark-haired girl throws the letter into the fireplace with a tired sigh, and wonders what the Duke was trying to do by testing her limits again in that way, sadly staring at the fire. Thus, the rumors that Caesar was hiding a woman inside the mansion spread, and all the ladies talked about it. 3 days ago, when the heart of the mermaid brought Orquanina revealed, some people witnessed how careful he was in carrying that supposed woman. The day Henry Petch got into trouble for messing with the Duke's woman spread with various rumors. After all, Bonaparte took back all the money they had lent to the Petch family. However, everyone wondered who the girl was who was so well treated by César, the woman who made the Duke fall in love. Meanwhile, the lessons with Flavia continued, but she could no longer bear seeing her family's name tarnished, wanting to get rid of the shoeshiner as soon as possible. Suddenly, the Madame decides to open the doors of the room where the protagonist was, shouting her name. And she turns to greet her, catching Flavia by surprise, because in just 3 days, she had become exuberantly beautiful. Her cheeks, once so thin, were more plump, and all the scars on her body seemed to have disappeared. She looked too much like the legend that sailors are drawn to, but the Madame's thoughts break when she realizes she is distracted, and she shouts that she heard about what happened, about how Adele appeared in front of the nobles with a wet body and bare feet, giving her a lecture that she should have stayed inside the mansion, but instead wandered off like a lost dog, and things like that happened. She yells that Adele should have trained her posture, not walked to the point of injuring her feet in a ridiculous manner. The protagonist lowers her head and apologizes, but the Madame tells her to be more sincere. Until the maid approaches, apologizing for interrupting the conversation, but she wanted to mention something. After a moment of hesitation, the Madame allows her to speak, and Epony thanks her, before saying that she didn't know etiquette as well as Flavia, but she believed that the current posture of the protagonist was ideal to be considered a beautiful figure. All of this should have been due to her excellent teaching methods, so she suggests they proceed to the next lesson. Flavia grits her teeth, thinking that Adele was too skilled to have gained Epony's favor with her charm, but even worse was knowing that the Duke was watching them. With no options, the Madame agrees with Epony's suggestion, but the lessons were not over yet. Therefore, she had to find a way to expel Adele as soon as possible, still with her hands trembling with anger. Time passes until sunset that day. As the Madame walked through the corridors of the house, she notices that Adele was so focused that it irritated her. In the end, she memorizes everything and has a great perception, very different from the ladies who resort to tantrums whenever they make a mistake. Frustrated, the Madame thinks that if she had shown even a little laziness, she could have used that as an excuse. That was when, amidst her thoughts, she was interrupted by the voice of a black-haired girl calling her name. Turning around, the Madame recognizes Lucrezia della Valle, who greets her elegantly, as expected of Flavia as the lady everyone idolized. Lucrezia smiles gracefully, mentioning that the Madame seemed to be in good health, to which the lady asks the reason for her appearing at the Bonaparte mansion, and she responds that she heard that everyone in society was visiting, and she decided to do the same. Seeing how busy they were, it seemed like a big banquet was being held for Orquanina, and the Madame agrees that was the case. The Duke had a deep connection with Orquanina, and now they even helped the new emperor ascend to the throne. Until Lucrezia touches her face, asking how Caesar has been these days, as she hadn't seen him for a while due to the self-reflection order. But there shouldn't be anything else happening now, which makes the Madame notice that she heard the rumors, certainly being worried about all this. As it would be revealed anyway, Flavia believed it would be better to mention that she was actually just the Duke's younger sister. So the Madame begins to say that the girl was the Duke's sister, but hesitates when something catches her attention, making her fall silent, staring at Lucrezia, who is confused by the sudden silence. And she asks if she had asked something too sensitive to answer, and she reflects that, thinking better, the person who would expel and pursue the protagonist didn't need to be herself. Smiling darkly as she realizes this, she stares at Lucrezia. The Madame had previously received a warning from Caesar, so she didn't know what could happen if this repeated. However, what would happen if the person intervening was Lucrezia herself? Even though she might be an elegant and impeccable young lady, if she were as naive as she seemed, she would never have been able to monopolize the position of Caesar's betrothed. Thus, Flavia asks her to listen carefully to what she is about to say, revealing that the woman in the rumors was a direct blood relative of Bonaparte. And Lucrezia sighs, realizing that Katerina and Rowan had another daughter, relieved because she understood everything wrong. But the Madame corrects her, saying it was not a misunderstanding, which catches her by surprise. That's because Adelaide was a member of Bonaparte and Caesar's younger sister. But that was what they were telling the public, as in reality, she could even be any random street dweller, so they could question the truth with Rowan and Katerina. Which makes the Madame think that if Lucrezia was as smart as she seemed, she would understand what she was saying. After thinking for a bit, Lucrezia thanks her for sharing her insights, giving a darker smile. After all, she always provided a guide on where to go. On another day during her meal, Epony suggested that the protagonist take a walk, as it was a noble activity and the Duke certainly wouldn't forbid it. The guests were planning to take a walk in the Garden of Lawn, so it would be better to head to the water garden. After that day, Adele noticed that her maid began to always carefully plan the guests' schedules. She tells her that in the water garden, there was a large installed fountain. It was very beautiful, and she would certainly be surprised to see it. Adele thinks she was being kinder to her, but it was certainly out of sympathy, so she thanks the maid while drinking her tea. Later, during the walk in the beautiful garden, the protagonist realizes that Epony was absolutely right, as it was a great place. Thanks to the humid air, her heart felt calmer, and Adele could only look at her surroundings in admiration. However, she hears a voice noticing someone was there. Turning around, the protagonist sees a dark-haired young woman approaching with her maid. It was none other than Lucrezia herself, who greets her with a smile, and Adele is surprised to recognize her after Epony's whispered alert. After all, she didn't even expect to see her so soon, and her nervous fingers fidget with the fabric of her dress. Deep down, she wasn't at all prepared for this encounter, but she forces herself to greet Lucrezia back. After receiving an intense look from the young woman, she smiles in return, commenting that she never saw her at the balls, and Adele reveals that she hasn't officially entered society yet. Then the young woman introduces herself as Lucrezia from the Delaval family and asks which family the protagonist belonged to. After taking a deep breath for a moment, Adele introduces herself as Adelaide Bonaparte, which makes Lucrezia feign surprise, and ask if it was a new joke circulating in society, embarrassed to say that her isolation ended not long ago. But the protagonist insists that it was exactly what she heard a little while ago. She was from the Bonaparte family, and due to various circumstances, was raised separately from her brother Cesar. That's when the lady's tone of voice turned darker, asking if she lived in the same house as the Duke, inside the palace, and Adele agrees, until Lucrezia interrupts her, smiling darkly, saying that since she became a Bonaparte, she has been thinking of leaving Fornati and exploring Saint-Nard. The protagonist gets confused, not understanding what exactly she was thinking. but responds that she wanted to stay close to her family, not yielding despite the pressure of the stairs, which makes the two of them stare deeply at each other, creating a dark and heavy atmosphere in the air. Adele feels that beautiful people are indeed impressively difficult to read, maybe because she was a true lady, or because she was too tense. That's when she hears her murmur that it was another obstacle, catching her off guard with a threatening tone. Raising her gaze again in Lucrezia's direction, she was smiling in that angelic way, saying it was great to meet her, with that fragile little smile. But she wished that heaven and the angels would protect her from assassins, which leaves her a bit shocked by the tension. The impression that fell on her shoulders, like a bucket of cold water, was that Lucrezia knew something, and seeing her turn to leave as if nothing had happened, the protagonist can only watch. At this, Epony mentions that they should inform the Duke about this. The conversation and especially the greeting were bothering her. Lucrezia couldn't directly oppose Caesar's intentions, but Adele felt cold sweat while reflecting on the matter, hearing that, as they say, submerged stones are more terrifying than the waves in front of you. Time passes, and it is evening when Lucrezia begins her journey back home. In her carriage, she wonders what she should do, covering her face with her hands to the concern of her maid. The lady, with tears in her eyes, murmurs that it seemed Lord Caesar was in love with a servant again, which shocks Hazel, the maid, as that woman they saw was the Duke's younger sister, but Lucrezia quickly denies this claim. Her mannerisms were not those of a young lady. To call someone like that a sister only made Lucrezia regret liking the Duke. Her voice trembles as she says that if that woman didn't seduce Caesar, then he must be planning to marry her, still crying in the carriage. Hazel says that if this is true, she shouldn't be crying like this, as they should act before Adele steals the Duke, otherwise she will become Adele Valley. The maid says they should get rid of that girl, to which Lucrezia asks how they would do that, hearing that they should fight. Still pretending to be a good girl, she denies this, as she didn't want to hurt others, and now she was scared of what would come in the future, which worries the maid, who raises her voice, shouting that there was no need to worry, as she would help her lady who was so fragile and sweet. Lucrezia smiles at Hazel, surprised, and leans in to hold her hand, asking if she would really do that for her, which obviously makes the maid agree, gently smiling that no matter the cost, she would help. Thus, the lady hugs her maid with tears in her eyes, thanking her and happy to have her by her side, promising never to forget her true loyalty, smiling darkly behind the poor manipulated maid. To ensure you don't miss the unfolding of this romance, give a gentle tap on the notification bell, and I see you on the next tale.